In this lecture, we'll learn about input groups. With input groups, we can add text, checkboxes, radio buttons, button groups, and drop-downs on either side of text-put elements. Input groups consist of a text input element and an element next to it that in some way describes it. Consequently, the label tag won't be used in an input group, but feel free to add an additional label or description text before it. An input group is wrapped in a div tag with the class input group. Inside this goes the input group add-on, which is a span tag with the class input group add-on and the ID add-on. The text content will be the hash symbol. Right after, we put an input tag with the type text, the class form control, a placeholder attribute with the value hashtag, and an area described by attribute with the value being the ID of the input group add-on. In the browser, we can now see our input group with a left-aligned add-on. To create an input group with a right-aligned add-on, we'll move our span element after the input element. We'll change the value of the placeholder attribute to username and the text content to @example.com and have another look in the browser. We can also have add-ons on both sides. Let's duplicate our span element and change the text content of the first one to $sign and the second one to .00. Since we now have two add-ons, we'll change the area described by attribute to an area label attribute and give it the value amount to nearest dollar. Let's see this example in the browser. We can add multiple add-ons in a row. We'll duplicate our first span element twice and change the text content to euro sign and pound sign. Let's see what this looks like. We can easily make our input group smaller or larger. To make our input group smaller, we simply add the class input group SM to input group container. We'll now duplicate our code and change the class to input group LG, which will make it larger. Let's go back to the browser again. Instead of a simple text-based add-on, we can also use a checkbox or radio button. We'll simply replace the text content in the first span element with an input with the type checkbox and an area label attribute with the value checkbox for text input. In our second span element, we'll replace the text content with an input with the type radio and area label attribute with the value radio button for text input. Let's view this in the browser. We can also use a button as our input group add-on. We'll replace the text content of the last span element with a button element with the type button, the classes btn and btn secondary, and the text search. We also need to change the wrapping class to input group btn. Let's see this in the browser. We will now replace 3 of our span elements with a drop-down. We'll delete the code and add a div tag with the class input group btn. Inside this div, we'll add a button with the type button, the classes btn, btn secondary, and drop-down toggle, the ID, input group drop-down, the data toggle attribute with the value drop-down, the area has pop-up attribute with the value true, and the area expanded attribute with the value false. We'll give it the text topic. Now we'll create our drop-down menu. We start with a div tag with the class drop-down menu and the area labeled by attribute with the value input group drop-down. Now we'll add the drop-down items. These are anchor tags with an empty href attribute and the class drop-down item. We will give them the text first item, second item, and third item. Let's see this in the browser. Finally, we will now create an input group with a segmented button and drop-down. Above our current drop-down, we'll add a new button with the type button, the classes btn and btn secondary, and the text topic. In our drop-down, we'll now add the class drop-down toggle split to the button tag. Change the button text to toggle drop-down and wrap the text in a span tag with the class SR only. Let's see this final example in the browser. We have now learned how to create input groups with text, checkboxes, radio buttons, button groups, and drop-downs on either side of text input elements. Go on and continue with the coding exercise, which will help you learn the correct structure for this component. In the next lecture, we'll learn how to create and use the Jumbotron component.